Hi, my name is Dan Baldwin, and I'm the Vice President of Technical Services for Hawks Pest Control. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the topic is protecting public health. And especially when it comes to the commercial environment, that is to a large degree what our role is. We're certainly protecting our clients, but most of the time in a public health setting or food processing setting, the reach of what we do is far greater than just the facility we're dealing with. But one thing to keep in mind is language is really important, and we're not really protecting public health. So public health is a science, and it's a science that deals with, preventing injury and disease, uh, by promoting healthy lifestyles and sanitation conditions, making sure that any environment that people find themselves in is a healthy environment. So we're not protecting a science. It's really more about how we protect the public's health. So as we're talking through these issues, and it is just going to be pretty high level, the idea is that when you have a food processing setting, pharmaceutical setting, warehousing, anything where there's a downline customer, our responsibility is to make sure that that environment is kept pest free and to make sure we're giving the client good information. It's easy for us to think about ourselves as pesticide applicators, and in most states, that's what our licenses will say. But that's not really what our function is. Our function is to provide information and do some preventative application when required. But most of the time, you're going to want to make sure that the environment is kept pest-free by working with the client to make sure that they're following proper structural sanitation and storage procedures to keep the pests out. And if they do get in, to make sure that they really can't survive. So one of the topics that was discussed more than once at the live pest management conference was this idea of One Health. And there are three major components to it. There's is certainly the environmental health concept, and that's both the macro environment and the micro environment. So we tend to think about environmental health and we think about everything, like an entire city or entire country or the whole planet. Much is made of climate change, the impact of things that we do on that. But the environment is whatever we define it to be. And in most cases, what we're concerned about is the microenvironment of the client itself and the area immediately surrounding our client's facility. Certainly, there's a human health component to it. And particularly when you're talking about pharmaceuticals or food processing, it's the products that are being prepared and the environment within which they are processed. How is the equipment maintained? The floors, even, somebody walking through a food processing facility with dirty floors, they have the chance to contaminate a piece of food processing equipment. So that's where your job as an observer and reporter really comes into play. And then the final element is animal health. There are certainly some of you who do get involved in places like dairies and egg facilities. But for our purposes here, it's not on the animal health side. It's really on the post-harvest or post-kill part of things, where we want to make sure that however things are processed, that it's done so in a sanitary manner. So just for some perspective, and I will say it's disappointing, these numbers that I see, because when I first started this type of presentation 5 or 6 years ago, these numbers were virtually the same. That on a yearly basis, 48 million people are impacted by a foodborne illness. 128,000 get hospitalized, and somewhere around 3,000 people die. And that's just in the United States. And again, the unfortunate thing is it's not changing. Despite all the emphasis we have on food safety and pest prevention and public health in general, we're still having these tremendous impacts. Now, not all of this certainly has anything to do with the intersection of professional pest management and food processing. Some of these things are, somebody prepared a luncheon, for a family gathering, and they had some sort of issue there, but it doesn't change year after year. We're still having these impacts. And while certainly nowhere near as important as the direct human impact, there is a financial impact, and it's somewhere between 1.5 and $50 billion a year between the cost of investigations, hospitalization, lost work hours. That's, another thing they worry about is 33 million healthy life hours are lost every year due to these issues. So, it's sometimes easy to say, oh, it's a little bit of food poisoning. I don't feel well. I ate something I shouldn't have. And you're probably fortunate if that's all it is, because these illnesses, these organisms that can cause these illnesses can be very significant and can be fatal. The three primary ones we worry about are Salmonella, Listeria, and norovirus. Norovirus really isn't much of an issue for us, but Salmonella and Listeria are, because where they can be found in a food processing environment is really the same place that the pests are likely to be. So you got those big three: Listeria, E. coli, norovirus, Salmonella. Rodents and cockroaches and flies can all play a part in spreading those organisms, particularly Salmonella and Listeria. E. coli to a degree, depending on the circumstances. But if you think about, Listeria can be found in drains. Decaying organic material may host Salmonella. And one of the reasons we focus on the sanitation aspect so much is these pests are going to be in these same areas. And it's not just the pests, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but it's what we do as well. Because you think about, we're crawling around on the floors in a lot of these areas. We're examining drains. We're feeling up underneath pieces of equipment, sometimes laying down on dirty floors. And then everything we have on us is now able to be spread through the environment. Number one is Listeria, and it's frequently detected in drains. It's kind of everywhere. And if you think about, if you are doing an investigation inside of a restaurant, let's say, and you put your hands down and you're feeling around, or maybe you're performing a drain cleaning service, anything you now touch after that service, you have the possibility of spreading the contaminated organic material as much as the pests that you're there to prevent. In some cases, even more. You think about, a rodent might crawl through a drain and get some on their fur, but it's going to stick. Whereas you've got nitrile or rubber gloves on, that's not going to stick very well to that. It's designed not to stick and penetrate. So, we need to be thinking about how we interact with the environment as well. Salmonella can be on the floor, can be in the drains. But the big thing, whether or not we're talking about pest-related issues or our activities, is to keep in mind that there are potential sources of contamination everywhere. And we need to be really mindful of, what we're doing, what the pests might be doing. And as we'll touch on again later, the remedies for these pest-related issues. We don't want to contaminate a food processing facility with pesticides any more than we do with contaminated organic material. So this little friend here, American cockroach, just a nice big pretty picture. We have a bunch of ants are coming to take it away, but Dr. Dina Branscombe is part of her program for her PhD at the University of Florida, did a really interesting study. And one of the questions I ask in live sessions is, how many of you, when you do a cockroach clean out, propose to remove the dead cockroaches afterwards? And it's surprisingly much more important than you might think. So when she did the study, they inoculated, meaning they actually took salmonella and dropped it onto the exoskeleton of cockroaches. And surprisingly, they found that they didn't detect very much on the surface of the insect afterwards. Now, certainly if there was organic material that they went through and got that on their legs, let's say, um, they could move that around. But just the microorganisms themselves didn't really show up on the outside of the insect. And the reason is the salmonella was able to penetrate the waxy cuticle and could be found inside the waxy cuticle. So you killed a cockroach, the cockroach dies. Let's say it's up in a drop ceiling. Over time, because they'll live for quite some time, the cockroach will desiccate and parts and pieces can break and fall down onto your food processing equipment or the lunchroom or the office or the dining room, doesn't matter where. And now you've got dead cockroach parts, which is disgusting enough all by itself, falling down into these surfaces, but they can contain the bacteria itself, ready to now find its way into a food source. So we really recommend that if you have to do a cockroach cleanout, that you talk to the client about doing cleanup afterwards. Certainly it costs more if you have to go back and clean things up, but if we're really worried about making sure that we are eliminating a potential food contamination source, that we do everything that we can to do so. So, how we impact public health or how we can influence protecting the public's health, we need to be really mindful of our interactions with the environment. We need to make sure that we're identifying conducive conditions and reporting those to the client. It doesn't do any good to simply make note of it and stick it on the service report and hope that somebody is going to take a look at that later. I certainly am well aware of how frustrating it can be to deal with some clients who don't really seem to value what we're trying to bring to the table. But the important thing is to identify a partner at the client's facility that you can go to them and not just present the report, but actually discuss your findings and the recommendations you're making so that we can really help them understand what it is that you're finding. The chances are that when you are doing your pest inspection, you're looking at their facility probably better than any of their employees do. Their employees go to the same place, do the same things every day, and they're not looking underneath every piece of equipment, whereas typically we are. They're not looking at or finding blocked drains. They're not seeing organic material building up behind a piece of equipment, but we are. So they need to understand that it's there. They need to know what to do to fix it or to hire us to fix it if your company offers that kind of service, or I should say, and understand the pest management ramifications of not making the correction. We want to work with them also on reducing pest introductions and infestations. Introductions can be hard to prevent. The larger facility you have, the more likely you have, raw products coming in, and who knows what the conditions were in that facility where the raw materials are coming from. But if you can help them develop processes to make sure that they're inspecting things, and you help them maintain their facility in such a way that if something does get introduced, it doesn't find a place to live, or if it does find a place to live, you have ways of making sure that you can find them very quickly, then you'll be doing them a great service. And then certainly reducing pesticide usage. On the outside of most facilities, chances are you're going to have to use pesticides. But on the inside of a facility, you want to really minimize it because the pesticides themselves can cause types of foodborne illnesses. We always want to use the least toxic option available, and we want to be really mindful of where we're putting them. So this picture is unfortunately not staged. I did not take this picture. It was sent to me. And I mean, in a nutshell, this is everything that we could probably do wrong. the chances that that is a non-contaminated, brand new compressed air sprayer that doesn't have any pesticides in it is pretty minimal. That sprayer has been in the back of somebody's service vehicle. It's probably been set on a dirty floor. It may have been set on the ground. We have no idea where that has been. It probably has some degree of pesticide contamination on the outside, because a person who is going to take an application device like that and set it directly on a wood food processing surface probably isn't that careful. So you've got the opportunity for microorganisms to be there. Certainly organic material that the organisms have been living in there, pesticide contamination. It's probably a sealed wood table, but we don't know. That gentleman's going to pick up that sprayer and go about his business, and hopefully whoever it is who's responsible for maintaining that area will come by and clean it up again before they start using it. But you can see the area looks fairly tidy. Chances are this is after shift. The tools are all put away, surface looks clean. Unfortunately, somebody might come in behind that and just start working with food material directly on that surface. I mean, there's just so much wrong with what's happening here. What about his gloves? Excuse me. You know, we carry our entire day's experiences out in the environment with us. Anything we came in contact with our hands, our clothing, is on us now as we move through these facilities. So it's always really important to keep in mind, where have my hands been? What have I touched before I go touch the next thing? In the restaurant environment, we talk a lot about washing your hands and changing gloves every time you change tasks. So we would want to employ the same kind of thinking here. Now, I know there are some of you who have to worry about, procurement issues, who would say, oh my goodness, how many pairs of gloves might we go through if every time I change tasks, I'm changing gloves? But remember what our responsibility is. Our responsibility is to protect our customer and our customer's customer. And gloves just aren't that expensive. But a foodborne illness or exposure to a pesticide can make somebody very ill or, unfortunately, cause death. So as we move through, we need to be mindful of where our hands have been, where they're going, where our equipment has been, where we're putting it. We never want to put equipment on any sort of a food prep surface. Generally speaking, unless it's something like a bait applicator that you might be using to apply one of the insecticidal baits, or a small hand duster, really things should not be above your waist and never above any sort of a food handling or food processing line or surface. And then think about, as you're moving through the facility itself, how are you approaching it? Let's start from the moment you get there. Is the first thing you do to go out to the dumpster corral and dig around there, changing the bait in the bait stations, cleaning those up, and then go in and immediately start working with a food prep surface? You always want to approach one of these facilities from the highest and cleanest downwards and towards the dirtiest. So you should have a clean uniform on. If it's the same uniform through the day, you want to make sure you have clean coveralls on, and start with new gloves and go to the cleanest areas first and work your way outwards from there, so that you're not running the risk of taking some organism that you picked up someplace else into what should be a clean or even potentially a sterile environment. And then making sure that whatever material you use is really appropriate for the setting. We're very fortunate here, and that the materials we have to choose from really work. I don't know, off the top of my head at least, of any registered pesticides that don't do precisely what they say they're going to do in the way they say they're going to do them. But you have to think about what it is you're trying to accomplish, and making sure that the cure isn't worse than the disease. So, you wouldn't want to walk into a clean food processing facility and use a dust material that could end up being tracked all over a food processing surface, right? It might be labeled for indoor use, but you have to think about what pest issue am I trying to solve? And using rodents as an example, you might be able to use something like a tracking powder inside of a wall void. But if the problem is that the rodent is in that wall void and then ending up in your food surface, your food processing surface, well, so is the tracking powder. Same with insecticidal dusts. Same thing with even liquid applications. If you're not going through and making sure that you're physically removing pests before you do your application, well, larger insects can crawl through some of these treated areas. They might track pesticides here and there. So, think about what it is you're using, why it is you're trying to use it, and what's going to happen once you leave. So after we think about, the environment and how we're interacting with it, we need to think about conducive conditions and where we can preventing introduction and certainly doing everything we can to prevent infestation. Probably all of us can eliminate a pest infestation, but unfortunately by that time it's kind of too late. The damage may have already been done. If the environmental conditions are such that a pest was able to be introduced and then reproduce, particularly think about something like cockroaches, if you've got active breeding, the chances that they are somehow getting into the organic material and spreading it around, it really is too late. We want to focus on prevention always, but certainly in either if we want to call it a public health setting, food setting, pharmaceutical setting, the focus really has to be on making sure that we try to keep the pests out. And if we can't, don't allow them to become an infestation. So a lot is talked about like habitat modification, but I like to kind of reframe it a little bit and talk about environmental exclusion. So a flying insect, a little bit of a challenge. Crawling insects depends on the circumstances. This one really is more focused on rodents, flies to a degree, because if you think about a lot of places will have dumpsters and compactors, right outside the back door. People leave the back door open. So environmentally, we're drawing things in, or at least giving suitable habitat, immediately outside our facilities. But particularly with rodents, we want to make sure that we are making sure that the facility itself is not attractive. In other words, we don't want a lot of low vegetation. We don't want a lot of stored material on the outside. If you think about how poorly rodents see and the fact that they are going to innately perform a risk reward analysis, if they walk up to an open environment and they have no reason to know that there is a food source or harborage nearby, they're going to do that calculation and say that it's not worth the risk. There's no reason for me to cross this large area and take the chances of getting picked off by a predator. So wherever you can, make sure that the facility is as clean and tidy as possible. They don't have to be all concrete and asphalt so that people don't like being there, but make sure that any vegetation is pruned up so that they don't have a great line of sight to find that next nearest place to go hide. Human activity is another big piece of it. It's an unfortunate reality that we a lot of times just let them in. So this is kind of behavioral exclusion, keeping the doors closed when not in use, not propping open the doors using your multi-catch device because it's easier to carry things in and out. Even facilities that have alarms on the doors, people will get really creative and take duct tape and tape that sensor shut and then use your multi-catch device to hold the door open so they can have a snack break, cigarette break, or just bring in more materials. Roll-up doors, keeping those closed so that birds don't fly into a facility. So we want to focus on environmental exclusion and behavioral exclusion. Those are things that we can really do something about by working with our clients. And then the physical environments of the client's facility itself. This is where it moves a little bit more into like traditional exclusion, where we think about sealing up the cracks and making sure that astragals and door sweeps are in place. Works on both sides of the building's envelope, though. It's not just the outside keeping things out. It also works on the inside when you do have those introductions. Many pests, if you don't give them a place to hide, they simply won't thrive. So it's great if you've got the outside of the building sealed up, but if the inside of the building, if a rodent gets dropped off on a pallet of raw goods and can find a great big gap around a pipe or a way to get into a piece of equipment, all the work you worried about on the outside really is for naught. And then understanding the physical environment conditions of the neighbors. But if you think about something like a food court or a shopping mall, sometimes it's the case where you have one of those facilities, but not the ones on either side of it, behind it, above it. So trying to understand, while you may not be able to do inspections of these, trying to understand what's happening in your neighbor's facilities. It's not a bad idea to get to know the other pest control companies. If there is a situation where there are multiple pest control companies working in one larger facility, like a shopping mall, I've certainly had it where we've had to cooperate with other pest control companies, and thankfully, it's always been a very collaborative effort. They don't want to have issues there either, but knowing what the other companies are doing can help make sure that everybody attacks a problem the same way, and that you're not chasing cockroaches, for example, from one facility to another, and then all the clients are upset. You solved your problem, you gave it to the next door neighbor, they came in a couple days afterwards and chased them all back to your facility. Now you've got two clients unhappy, rather than just having a 30-minute conversation where you can coordinate treatments or inspections or whatever it is and make sure that you solve the problem. So I got to thinking about these the internal environments, particularly of something like a shopping mall, but even like a food processing facility where you have multiple stages of product creation and oftentimes different owners. And as silly as it is, and with apologies to the movie, these things a lot of times really are like a box of chocolates, right? You've got all these individual cells with different things taking place inside each one of the shells, but there is a connection amongst all the different pieces. So what happens in one area can impact what's happening in others. So the internal environment becomes very complicated. What's happening on the outside typically is fairly straightforward. You can see everything that's around you. You typically can control the environment in terms of the sanitation and storage conditions. Structural issues are usually easy to find and correct. Inside, it becomes a lot more challenging. If you think about something like this, right? This is a blueprint or layout, I should say, grabbed off the internet. And look at all the different things taking place inside this one facility. You've got department stores that may or may not have some sort of a diner in them. You've got a variety of small shops, which may or may not be food. There's an indoor amusement park, a water park. Both of those people are probably bringing in food from home. You've got a movie theater. They're absolutely going to have food. And the way that movie theaters a lot of times do the cleaning can make our job a little bit more difficult. And then you've got straight up restaurants and food courts. So you've got all throughout this map here, you've got opportunities for things to be brought in, doors that are open. You probably got loading doors that people keep open in the common areas, people bringing in their own food, everything that pests would ever want or need right in this one environment. And then you've got all the engineering spaces that help create this very large facility. So we really kind of get back to that box of chocolates idea. you might have the amusement park at the top, and that might be it. But as you can see to the left-hand side, there's a bunch of little shops there. We don't know here what those are, but there's a good likelihood that one of those or more of them has food inside of it. So somebody brings in pests from the amusement park, they go over to the food court. Somebody, brings in contaminated food and, with a pest issue, and it now ends up in the amusement park's concession stand. So this is one of those places where you have to go far beyond what your client expects in terms of taking care of their facility to really understand what's happening all around you so that you can coordinate with the client, coordinate with the mall management, and again, potentially other pest control companies to make sure that everybody is working together. This is a small food processing facility. Here, you've got freezing and boxing down at the bottom. You've got post-cooked items up at the top. Think about how how the products are moving through a facility, and understand that the pests you may encounter are going to likely be different in a place where they have raw goods versus the post-cooking goods. And your pest management layout should reflect the differences in how you approach these different areas. Should always be, starting off with the inspection and all the steps we want to take, but the actions that you may take are probably going to be different. One note on the freezer component, any kind of a cold storage, I asked this question in a live presentation: how many people, lay out a pest prevention program inside frozen or cooled areas? And there were some, but most did not. But if you think about how a freezer is constructed, particularly a commercial freezer that you'd run into a food processing plant, you've got an exterior wall of the freezer, you've got an insulated cavity, and then an interior wall. And most freezers are going to be able to support rodents inside the insulated space in between those two walls. So just because it's a frozen environment doesn't mean you don't have to inspect, and certainly does not mean that you don't have to do anything in there. There are companies who actually make glue boards that can go down to below freezing temperatures because the rodents can live inside there very easily. And a good sized rat is not going to be deterred from going into a frozen area for a little bit to go find the food that is unprotected. So back to the human activity. Again, I didn't take this picture, but I saw it an awful lot, particularly when I was working in the restaurant industry, but you see it everywhere. People just prop the doors open. In this case, it doesn't say we want to keep the pests out. This one is a direct physical danger. It says right on there, danger, never open this door after dark. Your life could depend on it. The sign is huge. It's red and white. And yet the door is propped open. It's probably a hot night, hot inside the kitchen, and they wanted to cool it down some. It's understandable, but not only can people walk in, but flying insects can come in, crawling insects, rodents, anything that wants to come right through that door can. And all the pest prevention activities you want to take on the outside wouldn't make a darn bit of difference. So if you see this kind of thing, this is where your reporting and communication task really comes into play. Your client needs to understand that while you were there at the facility, the door was left wide open, and they need to understand the impacts of it. Now, they probably will and definitely should focus more on the public safety component because they could let an intruder in, but you definitely want to make sure they understand that they are opening themselves up to a pest infestation risk. This one, probably all of you have seen it. Again, this, I don't know where this picture came from, but if you look at the conditions of that drain, that's when we started off talking about listeria in particular. There's organic material in there. The water is backed up at the bottom. If you go and reach in there with your gloved hand, and then you take that very same hand and put it on the food prep surface to lift yourself up, anything that was in that drain is now going to be on the food prep surface. And if you don't clean it up and sanitize it, simply washing it with some soap and water isn't sufficient. The thought that somebody else is going to come along and take care of that for you, probably not. So you've just created another foodborne illness opportunity. This one I did take. It's the inside of a loading dock of a shopping mall in Southern California. There are dumpsters, trash collection. It's down at the bottom of a ramp, and so you can see the big water puddle there. Every time they turn on the sprinklers outside for the landscaping, water collects. When it rains, water collects. It's a completely protected, nice, warm environment where there's plenty of food. There's a fair amount of rodent activity in there, which is why I got called in the first place to try to figure out why a rodent had fallen out of the ceiling into a dining room. And then you've got these common spaces. People feel they're safe, they're protected. They can leave the hallway door open as they take the trash out. So anything that shows up in that loading dock area can simply go wherever it wants. When you find yourselves in these situations, you've got to be really curious about how things work. The first time you walk into a facility like this, you should be asking what the policies are in keeping the doors closed. Are there automatic door closers? Do they have air curtains over the doors? How often is the trash taken out? You might want to know how often the dumpsters themselves are changed and cleaned. So in every setting, whether it's a home or large food processor, you want to make sure that you're asking a lot of questions about everything that happens in the facility, and somewhat even more so in what's happening around your client's facility. Also around the facility are the spaces in between. And this is one of the reasons why there was a rodent issue to begin with. Because a lot of times these shopping malls get built, or even food processing facilities, they get built with one use in mind. The original intent behind a particular space is a piece of equipment, or in this case, a particular restaurant. But things change over time. Whether or not it's the food processing facility upgrading things, or changing their processes, or in this case, a new restaurant client coming in and their equipment wasn't exactly the same size, we create void spaces. In this case, if that's a 2x6 aluminum stud there, that space is probably an additional 10 inches. You can see that there is damage to the sheetrock on the inside. So the sheetrock side is the space that goes into the restaurant. The side with the metal studs, it goes to an exterior wall. So if rodents can penetrate, and they did, not from this space, but from another space further down the hallway, they were able to get into this space here and then gain access to the wall inside. This was not something that was accessible to the pest management provider who was there. So they could never have seen this. But if they had asked to see the blueprints for the facility, or just try to be a little bit more engaged, they could have at least understood that there was potential for there to be spaces behind their restaurant where any number of things could be taking place. One of the recommendations here would be to install some sort of an access port so that you could do routine inspections and have devices in these spaces. So this little collage here is more from that facility. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see one of the rodents that was in and behind the insulation that was over the dining room. And so what was happening in this case is, from a connected but not connecting facility. So you had this restaurant, then you had that hallway space, which was common area. There was another food facility on the other side of the hallway. Same kind of conditions, where the rodents were able to go up in the inside of the wall, come across the drop ceiling, get down into these void spaces, and then exploit holes that people didn't know were there and get behind the insulation in the dining room that had been painted for decorative effect. So you just had rodents crawling around behind the insulation, and finally either it had become urine soaked enough, or just enough rodents were in there. The piece of insulation dropped and a rodent fell out onto somebody's table. But if you look at all these pictures, there are all these spaces. In the bottom left-hand corner, you got space behind an oven row. Lots of opportunity for organic material, like grease, to build up back there, but not a lot of opportunity for anybody to clean it. The other pictures are overhead spaces, wall spaces, where anything that gets in there can go wherever it wants. Directly next door to this facility, you couldn't tell it from the outside because all the signage had been removed, but there was an old pizza parlor right next door. And when they left, they pretty much left everything behind. So rodents had been able to get in, and for a while they were quite content to eat all the food that was left behind. But again, there were more of these spaces where the rodents could access the in-between areas and move around the facility and then finally find a way to get in. So it wasn't that the pest provider there was doing a horrible job. It's just that somebody didn't ask enough questions and didn't use their intellectual curiosity to say, what is here, what is there, try to get up above these areas and make sure that they had a really good handle on everything that was going on. They said, this is the restaurant, and I'm going to do all my services here. I'm going to do the inspection. Their reports were great, but they didn't look beyond that interior envelope of what was actually happening inside the restaurant, instead of just going and looking further, looking deeper into the building itself. And, finally, we want to make sure again that when you do have an introduction that turns into an infestation, or even when it's just at that introduction state, that we don't do anything to contaminate an environment that should be relatively sterile. You would say, well, it's a food processing facility. It's not really, but if you think about like an airport, they call it a sterile environment where only things that are supposed to be there are there. Same idea here. We don't want to take any of our materials, whether or not it's a pesticide or piece of equipment, and put it someplace where it can then cause a bigger issue than the pest issue itself. So where you're applying the products, how you're applying the products, who's there while you're making the application, are all things that you really need to understand so that we don't cause a bigger problem. So to run through a few concepts here, and this also is from that same presentation I did years ago, where we looked at the numbers for the impact of foodborne illnesses. These things are not likely to change. What a public health or food processing client is going to need is going to stay pretty much the same. We talk about the evolution of business and all that. These concepts are pretty much universal, and I don't see them changing very much. So the first one is, you need a superbly trained, highly engaged service person. Commercial accounts in general, but particularly where food or pharmaceuticals are involved, you want somebody who just doesn't know how to use a bait applicator or use their compressed air sprayer. They need to understand the whys of everything that they're doing. They need to really understand the value of the inspection, of the service report, communicating to the client, and any choices that they make when they are making their applications, or how to properly prioritize recommendations for the client. They really need to be a professional. You should not grab some brand new person and say, we've got to perform this stop today, you go do it. These are not stops. These are our clients, and they're clients who can impact a lot of people with the products that they're producing. You want a pre-established escalation and communication program. You don't want to have something go wrong and then try to figure out with whom you need to speak and how they are going to interpret your information. If you set it up ahead of time and you tell them the kinds of things you're going to be communicating to them and what the mutual expectations are, when something goes wrong, it doesn't seem like you are trying to make excuses or trying to shift the blame, right? If you're just filling out service reports and you don't know to whom they go, suddenly you're on the phone saying, well, you guys didn't clean up this mess or you didn't fix that wall. It sounds like you're saying, yeah, there's a problem, but it's not my problem, it's yours. Even if that's the case, which a lot of times it is, if the client's not helping us, um, you want to establish your contact, that the method of communication, and what to expect when something goes wrong as far as escalation goes, at least in general terms. If you think about a restaurant chain, you might have general escalation procedures for a cockroach issue or rodent issue, but the circumstances of each facility are going to be a little different. But your client should still understand that if there is an issue, you are going to follow certain key processes to make sure that you're addressing the situation and that everybody, including the site staff and corporate management, are involved. Again, just like the treatment and escalation plans, you want, or communications and treatment escalation plans, you want your treatment protocols to be reasonably consistent. They should know, both your client and your service personnel should know what is expected of them during a service, so that as they're reading through reports, things feel familiar. I'm going to do an inspection. I'm going to do here first. I'm going to walk my way through here. And the last thing I'm going to do is there. I found this, I found that. You're trying to build partnerships. This should not be a transactional thing. So the more a client understands, at least at a basic level, what you're going to be doing, it's much easier for them to understand when something is going wrong, that this is all expected and you already have a plan to deal with it. You want to make sure that you have active service management. It's not enough to have the same service professional going all the time, doing a really good job of performing the service. Your clients need to see your management staff. Your service personnel will appreciate it because they know you're there to give them support. And the client will appreciate it because they know that somebody additional is watching over what is a very important process, right? You're providing a service to the client that they absolutely need to protect themselves and protect the public. So the more engaged you are, the better they're going to feel about it, which also reinforces the first couple of points, making sure that you have a good communication escalation plan, and they're going to know that you're following up on the service procedures. Thorough inspections kind of goes without saying, but a lot of times it doesn't happen. Service personnel show up and they won't have made the proper contact. This happens a lot where you have a substitute service person who will go and try to perform the service. They didn't get the right time. They didn't talk to the right person. And you look at how long they were there, and it's, let's say a restaurant that should have taken you 45 minutes and they were there for 15 or 20. Yes, you could say you checked off the box. I did the stop. But you didn't do what the client is paying you to do, which is to protect them from the risks associated with pest presence or the conducive conditions. So you want to make sure that the thorough inspection is there every time. And from an active management perspective, you want to go looking for these situations where that inspection didn't take place, and then counsel your people appropriately. In addition to the thorough inspection, you want to make sure that your people are trained to give actionable information. They observed something. We don't want to give a customer a list of 500 different things and only 3 of them really matter. Every little piece of food debris you find on the floor is not its own observation, right? It's not something they're going to spend time trying to correct. But if you can tell them about the big things first, you don't want to ignore those other ones, but prioritize. Give them some actions that they can take. I found a lot of organic material built up underneath the equipment. Please clean and sanitize the area. Doesn't have to be any more specific than that, but now you're giving them something they can have somebody go do. We already talked about active service management. Even more important, though, is active case management when things do go wrong. You don't want it to be the situation where just some manager who happens to be around takes the call, and then the next time they call back in, they get somebody else, and you have to say, oh, well, let me look at your notes. I'll get back to you. If your client has a pest issue, they want to know that somebody there in management, in a position of responsibility, is directing what's happening, is communicating with a service person on a regular basis, and is getting back to them proactively to let them know how things are going. That way the client sees engagement. Again, we don't want to be transactional where just the next company can come along. We'll give you a better price. We're running a special. You want to develop the relationship. And one of the ways to do that is upfront with the active communication escalation. And then when something does go wrong, and it probably will, you take ownership of it and help lead the client through it rather than having the client beg you the way through it. You want to make sure you have consistent QA activities. So depending on the size of the facility and the potential risk, maybe the QAs are monthly, maybe they're quarterly, maybe they're once a year for a bottling warehouse. You have to do the assessment yourself and determine what the risks are, but you have to actually do it. If you say you're going to do it, you need to do it when you said and how you said, right? That's one of the biggest challenges I see in our industry is we know what to do. We tell the client what it is we're going to do, but then we don't quite do it. So if we just do what we say we're going to do, then the client will get the results that they're after, and we'll build those kinds of relationships that we need. And then if possible, depending on the level of sophistication your organization has as far as, collecting and interpreting data, you want to be the one to bring issues to the client, not the other way around. So if you are consistently getting pest activity in certain parts of the facility, you want to make sure that you're bringing that to the client, saying, we have observed over the past 30, 60, 90 days, that depends on the frequency of your service, that there's something going on here, right? We maybe found this initial one, you investigated it, but we're still seeing it. So collecting data, interpreting data, and then turning it into some sort of a communication plan that gets the client to understand what's actually happening and what may need to be done is really, really important. So with that, thank you very much. And I hope this was somewhat useful to you.